Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey back in time, not to witness grand battles or political upheavals, but to explore something perhaps far more perilous to the individual constitution: Victorian fashion. Imagine yourself for a moment, strolling down a cobbled street, the gaslight casting long, flickering shadows. You see figures approaching, women whose silhouettes are at once familiar and utterly alien, defined by curves that seem to defy gravity, particularly at the back. What alchemy of fabric and structure sculpts such an astonishing shape? Tonight, we delve into the world of the bustle, and specifically, how Victorian ladies actually managed those enormous posterior prominences. You might think your current fashion struggles are real, wrestling with skinny jeans that feel like a second skin after a big meal, or a tie that's just a little too tight. But let me tell you, you probably wouldn't survive a week, let alone a year, navigating the complexities of daily life with a full-blown Victorian bustle strapped to your person. It was a commitment, a statement, and quite frankly, a bit of an architectural marvel. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support, however you choose to show it, truly helps the channel grow and allows me to keep unearthing these fascinating and sometimes faintly ridiculous corners of history for you. And while you're at it, why not let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world? It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel, reaching you as you unwind and prepare for rest. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a sudden explosion of fabric, but with a subtle shift in the fashionable winds of the mid-19th century. You see, the preceding decades had been dominated by the voluminous crinoline, that great bell of a skirt that gave women the appearance of gliding, their feet often hidden beneath a vast circumference of material. But fashion, as you know, is a restless creature, always seeking the next new line, the next startling silhouette. By the late 1860s, the tide was beginning to turn. The grand circular sweep of the crinoline started to deflate, not entirely, but it began to shift its emphasis. Instead of an all-around fullness, the fabric started to gather, to be pulled towards the back, creating a shape that was less bell and more like a ship in full sail, seen from behind. This wasn't an overnight transformation, mind you. It was a gradual evolution, a series of subtle experiments. Imagine yourself as a fashionable lady of, say, 1868. You're looking at the fashion plates arriving from Paris, or perhaps observing the trendsetters in your own city. You notice the skirts are no longer quite so round. There's a certain drape, a certain emphasis, a gathering of material that creates a soft trailing fall at the back. This was the nascent whisper of what would become the bustle. The first definite bustle era is generally considered by fashion historians to be from around 1869 to 1876. After this, there was a brief interlude where slimmer, more natural, though still heavily corseted lines prevailed, often called the princess line or natural form era. But the allure of the prominent posterior proved too strong, and the bustle made a dramatic comeback, even larger and more pronounced, from about 1883 to 1889. So, what was this thing, this bustle? At its core, it was a device, an understructure, designed to support the drapery of the skirt at the back, lifting it up and away from the legs, creating that distinctive protruding silhouette. It aimed to accentuate the hips, and in conjunction with the tightly laced corset that cinched the waist to an often alarmingly small circumference, it helped to sculpt what was considered the ideal feminine figure of the time, an exaggerated hourglass, an S shape when viewed from the side. You might think of it as the 19th century equivalent of a particularly ambitious push-up bra, but for your behind. A rather cheeky comparison, perhaps, but the intent to enhance and exaggerate a particular part of the anatomy isn't entirely dissimilar. The earliest forms of these dress improvers, as they were sometimes euphemistically called, were often quite modest. They weren't necessarily the elaborate cages of steel and whalebone that we might picture from the bustle's high noon. Initially, you might have encountered simpler solutions, pads filled with horsehair, which was springy and held its shape, or down for a softer, more cushion-like effect. Some were made from starched or quilted fabrics, cleverly folded and layered to provide the necessary lift. Picture a small, crescent-shaped cushion tied around your waist, nestled just below your corset, giving your skirt that fashionable little pouf at the back. Sometimes it was little more than a series underscore of ruffles sewn into the petticoat or the skirt itself. There's a rather amusing quirkiness to these early attempts. One can imagine resourceful women, eager to be in vogue, but perhaps without immediate access to the latest Parisian contraptions, improvising with whatever was at hand. Who knows, maybe a strategically placed, very small and very firm pillow did the trick for some in the very early days. The adoption of the bustle, like any fashion, wasn't just about looking good or what was deemed good at the time. It was also deeply entwined with social context. Historians still argue whether the primary driving force behind the bustle's adoption was purely aesthetic preference, a collective artistic whim that decided backsides were in, or if it was more deeply tied to displaying wealth and leisure. After all, navigating the world with such a protuberance, especially the larger versions, was hardly conducive to strenuous physical activity or manual labor. A grand bustle could signal that you were a lady of leisure, not required to, say, scrub floors or operate heavy machinery. It spoke of a certain social standing. You can imagine the rustle and sway as these newly shaped skirts moved through drawing rooms and along city promenades. The feel of it must have been peculiar at first. This new weight, this unfamiliar architecture, altering your very posture and gait. It's a bit like when you wear a really elaborate costume for a party, and suddenly you're so much more aware of your own dimensions, carefully calculating your turns through doorways. Victorian women lived this, to varying degrees every single day. It's almost comical to think that while men were pioneering industry and expanding empires, women were pioneering new ways to make their rears look fashionably enormous. A slight exaggeration, of course, but the dedication to the silhouette was undeniably impressive. These initial, often softer bustle forms were laying the groundwork, a sartorial stepping stone. The fashion was taking hold, the silhouette was gaining popularity, and designers and manufacturers were only just beginning to explore the structural possibilities. The desire for an ever more defined, ever more dramatic posterior projection would soon lead to an explosion of innovation in underwear engineering. Simple padding and horsehair cushions would evolve into intricate constructions of wire, cane, and whalebone, each promising the perfect foundation for the fashionable skirts of the day. The journey into the heart of the bustle, its very bones and sinews, was just beginning, and oh, what a curious journey it would prove to be. So you'd find yourself venturing into a world of surprisingly industrial-sounding materials. Think of finely tempered steel, often in the form of flat watch springs, which offered both resilience and a degree of flexibility. These could be bent into elegant curves, forming hoops and supports that would spring back into shape. Whalebone, or more accurately baleen from the mouths of whales, was another classic choice, beloved for centuries by corsetiers and hoop skirt makers for its unique combination of strength, lightness, and pliability. It could be steamed and shaped, holding its form beautifully. Then there was cane or rattan, lightweight and easily bent, often used to create the frame of these structures, giving them a sort of basket-like quality. Sometimes you'd even encounter wire mesh, molded into the desired shape, or, for the more budget-conscious or experimental, materials like treated paper or even vulcanized rubber, though these perhaps lacked the finesse of their steel and baleen counterparts. These frameworks were then typically covered in sturdy, unassuming fabrics, like cotton or linen, utilitarian and plain, as they were never meant to see the light of day. Their sole purpose was to support the glorious illusion above. Indeed, the journey into the very heart of the bustle, its structural soul, reveals a fascinating intersection of ingenuity, fashion imperative, and, let's be honest, a touch of the absurd. As the demand for a more pronounced posterior curve grew, those initial soft pads of horsehair or down, while still in use for a gentler effect, soon found themselves competing with far more ambitious underpinnings. You see, to achieve the increasingly dramatic silhouettes, especially during the bustle's triumphant second act in the 1880s, you needed something with a bit more architectural integrity, something that could stand up, quite literally, to the weight of heavy Victorian dress fabrics like velvet, wool, or richly embellished silks. The designs themselves were a testament to Victorian inventiveness, evolving quite distinctly through the bustle's two main periods of popularity. During that first wave, from roughly 1869 to 1876, the contraptions, often known by the French term tournure, tended to create a softer, sloping effect. They might consist of a series of fabric ruffles stiffened with horsehair, or perhaps a half hoop of steel that lifted the fabric more gently. Some resembled a sort of fabric waterfall, cascading down from the waist to support the draping of the skirt. You might find a crinolette, which was like a small crinoline that was open at the front and only provided fullness at the back. These were often integrated with multiple petticoats to achieve the desired shape and prevent the dreaded outline of the structure from showing through the dress. You'd tie this chosen device around your waist, usually over your tightly laced corset, because one restrictive undergarment was rarely enough, it seems, and under at least one or two petticoats. The sheer number of layers involved is quite something to contemplate. You can almost hear the subtle creak of whalebone, the faint rustle of steel springs against fabric. As you moved, imagine the feeling of being so thoroughly trussed up, the constant awareness of this structure appended to your back. It's a wonder they didn't require planning permission for some of the larger models, and pity the poor soul who accidentally backed into a delicate vase or a small child. The resulting clang or yelp must have been quite the social moment. Some of these contraptions, particularly the more cage-like ones, looked like they could quite easily double as a very uncomfortable picnic basket, though perhaps not ideal for keeping your sandwiches uncrushed. But then came the 1880s, and with it, the rise of the shelf bustle. And when I say shelf, you can almost picture it. These were often larger, more angular, and sat quite high on the back, creating a very prominent, almost horizontal projection that looked, well, like you could rest a tea service upon it. Though please, don't try to picture that too vividly, for the sake of both the tea service and the lady. Many of these later bustles were true feats of engineering. The Langtry bustle, for instance, named in popular association with the famous actress Lily Langtry, though she likely didn't endorse it personally in any official capacity, was a well-known type. It was typically a cage of hinged, steel wires that could be adjusted with tapes to modify the size and shape of the protrusion. Imagine a sort of collapsible lobster tail, or perhaps a miniature, wearable bird cage, designed to give your skirts that fashionable liftoff. Some designs were articulated, with springs and hinges, allowing for a modicum of movement. This was crucial, as you can imagine, for attempting everyday actions like, say, sitting down without the entire contraption, either collapsing dramatically or propelling you forward, like a poorly designed ejector seat. Some even claimed to be oscillating or spring-loaded to accommodate movement more gracefully. One popular design was the Wells Health Bustle, which despite its name, still involved strapping a wire cage to your person, but it was marketed as being more flexible and allowing for better ventilation. A rather optimistic claim, one might think, given the circumstances. Fashion historians and material culture experts continue to debate the extent to which off-the-shelf, mass-produced bustles dominated the market versus custom-made or home-adapted versions, especially outside major urban centers or for women of more modest means. While catalogs from department stores showcased an astonishing variety of patented designs, each promising the perfect silhouette, it's likely that many women or their dressmakers continued to create or adapt bustle forms using more traditional padding techniques or by modifying older structures. One can only imagine the quiet experimentation that must have gone on. Were there ever attempts at, say, inflatable bustles for easy travel, like a sort of Victorian pool floaty for your posterior? Probably not widely successful, if they existed at all, due to the risk of an untimely deflation at a society ball, the horror, or perhaps a bustle with tiny, cleverly concealed compartments for a fan, or a very slim volume of poetry, or dare we even suggest, a discreet snack for those interminably long sermons or operas. A lady can dream, can't she? The focus, however, remained firmly on the external architecture. So you've selected your device, a marvel of wire and whalebone, or perhaps a more demure cushion of horsehair. You've navigated the claims of the advertisers, each promising the ultimate in fashionable support. But acquiring the bustle was only the first step. How exactly did this carefully constructed piece of engineering become part of your daily attire? How did it integrate with the corset, the camise, the petticoats, and finally, the dress itself? That, my friends, is where the true endurance test began, the daily ritual of construction and assembly that was Victorian dressing. So you've acquired your chosen bustle, perhaps a formidable cage of steel and whalebone, or a more modest series of starched ruffles. It sits there, an inert object, full of promise for the fashionable silhouette it will help create. But its transformation from a mere undergarment into an integral part of your person was a daily ritual, an intricate, often exhausting process of construction and assembly that truly tested a Victorian lady's endurance, and often her patience. Forget simply slipping into a dress. This was more akin to a careful, multi-stage engineering project performed on the human body. The entire endeavor began, as you might expect, from the inside out, with layers designed for hygiene, comfort, a relative term as you'll see, and the all-important foundation. First, you don your camise, a loose-fitting garment of linen or cotton, typically knee-length, providing a soft barrier between your skin and the more structured items to come. Then came your stockings, perhaps of fine silk, if you were well-to-do, or sturdy cotton, held up not by elastic, which was still in its infancy and not widely used in this way, but by garters tied above or below the knee. Following this, you'd step into your drawers, which, in a rather quirky detail that often surprises modern sensibilities, were frequently crotchless, consisting of two separate legs, joined only at the waistband. This rather practical design, historians suggest, simplified matters considerably when nature called, especially given the mountain of fabric you'd eventually be wearing. Next came the star player of the Victorian undergarment world, the corset. This was no gentle shaper, no flimsy piece of lingerie. Your typical Victorian corset was a formidable piece of engineering in its own right, crafted from strong coutil fabric and reinforced with numerous strips of steel or whalebone, designed to sculpt your torso into the fashionable hourglass shape, cinching your waist to what we would today consider an alarmingly small circumference. You'd hold your breath, or perhaps onto a bedpost, as your lady's maid, or a sister, or even your long-suffering mother, pulled the laces at the back tighter and tighter still. The sensation was one of being firmly encased, your posture immediately corrected, your breathing perhaps a little shallower. Only then, once your torso was suitably molded, was it time to introduce the bustle itself. This apparatus, whether a cage, a pad, or a series of stiffened crescents, would be tied or buckled around your waist, positioned carefully over the back of the corset to give that essential lift to your posterior. You'd feel its weight, its presence, a new dimension added to your form. Getting it to sit just right, not too high, not too low, not askew, was critical for the final look. And you weren't done yet, not by a long shot. Over the bustle, and indeed over the entire lower half of your torso and legs, came the petticoats, not just one, mind you. Several were usually required. The first might be a bustle petticoat, specifically designed with extra fabric or shaping at the back to flow smoothly over the bustle's structure, helping to disguise its lines and prevent it from looking like you'd merely strapped a bird cage to your rear. Additional petticoats followed, perhaps one of flannel in the colder months for warmth, and then one or two more of cotton, possibly starched or adorned with ruffles at the hem to add further volume and ensure the dress skirt hung with the desired fullness and didn't simply collapse around the bustle's edges. Each layer added to the weight, the warmth, and the characteristic rustle that announced your approach. You can almost imagine the checklist running through your head, or your maid's camise check, stockings, garters, check, drawers, check, corset laced to within an inch of its life, check, bustle securely anchored and pointing fashionably aft, check. It's a small joke, but the process was indeed systematic. Finally, after all this foundational work, came the dress itself. For much of the Victorian era, dresses were often constructed in two pieces, a fitted bodice and a separate skirt. The skirt, of course, was tailored with the bustle in mind, with ample fabric at the back, intricately pleated, draped, swaged, or gathered to fall beautifully over the supporting structure. You'd carefully maneuver into this, often with assistance, lest you snag the delicate dress fabric on the underpinnings or displace your carefully arranged bustle. The bodice would then be put on, meticulously fastened with a bewildering array of tiny buttons or hooks and eyes, often requiring nimble fingers and a good deal of patience. And let's not forget dress shields, small absorbent pads often tacked or pinned into the armholes of the bodice to protect the precious fabric from perspiration, because cleaning these elaborate gowns was an ordeal in itself, and often prohibitively expensive. How long did this entire production take, you ask? Certainly not the 5 minutes you might spend throwing on jeans and a t-shirt. For an upper-class woman, especially if she was preparing for a day with multiple social engagements, requiring different outfits, a morning dress, perhaps a walking dress, an afternoon reception gown, and then an evening or dinner dress, The process of dressing and undressing, invariably with the assistance of her lady's maid, could consume a significant portion of her day. An hour to get fully attired for a formal occasion wouldn't have been unusual. This is a mainstream historical fact, often highlighted in social histories of the period. Social historians and costume scholars sometimes debate the degree of physical discomfort voluntarily endured by women in pursuit of fashion versus the extent to which such attire was imposed by societal expectation and a lack of practical alternatives for respectable dress. Was it pure vanity or a complex interplay of social pressure, personal expression, and the simple reality of what was available and deemed appropriate? It's a fascinating question with no simple answer. The whole ritual feels so distant from our modern sensibilities of comfort and ease. Think of your most high-maintenance getting ready routine, perhaps for a very grand wedding or a costume party, and then imagine multiplying the complexity and performing it daily, without the benefit of zippers as we know them, or stretchy, forgiving fabrics like lycra. It's a testament to dedication, or perhaps resignation. It's a wonder some didn't just advocate for sleeping elegantly upright in a supportive armchair, just to save themselves half the trouble each morning. Though one must concede, a fully deployed bustle would likely make for a rather lumpy and impractical night's rest, even in an armchair. So, after much pulling, lacing, tying, buttoning, and strategic arranging, you are, at long last, assembled. A walking, talking masterpiece of Victorian fashion engineering. But the day is young, and the world awaits. How then did you navigate that world, encased in your layers, balanced by your corset, and projected by your bustle? How did you move, sit, or even simply exist within this carefully constructed shell? That, my dear listener, is where the real adventure begins. So, there you are, a fully assembled Victorian lady, a symphony of fabric, whalebone, and steel, ready to face the world. The real adventure, as we hinted, truly begins now, as you attempt to navigate the currents of daily life with this rather significant appendage dictating your every move. It's one thing to stand still and admire the fashionable silhouette in the pier glass. It's quite another to translate that static image into graceful or even just functional motion. Your very first steps of the day would feel different. You're no longer just moving your legs, you're piloting a delicate and sometimes rather unwieldy extension of yourself. Your gait might be subtly altered, perhaps a little more of a sway, to accommodate the mass behind you, your arms held slightly away from your sides to avoid crushing any drapery. You become acutely aware of your tail, as it were. Doorways, once simple thresholds, now present a strategic challenge. You'd quickly master the art of the slight sideways shuffle, angling your way through narrower passages to avoid a disastrous scrape, or heaven forbid, getting momentarily wedged. Imagine the gentle clatter if your bustle frame bumped against a door jamb, a sound that would become as familiar as the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. You'd need the spatial awareness of a seasoned removalist just to get through breakfast without incident. Going up and down stairs, that was a whole new level of athleticism, pardon the pun. You'd gather your skirts with one hand, careful to lift them just enough to clear the steps without revealing too much ankle the horror, while simultaneously managing the behavior of the bustle itself. Some of the springier models might compress and rebound with each step, creating a rather peculiar bobbing sensation. You'd learn to ascend and descend with a measured, deliberate pace, lest you trip over your own voluminous drapery or cause your bustle to perform an unintended acrobatic feat. Then there was the eternal question, the one that springs to everyone's mind when contemplating these garments. How on earth did you sit down? This was, indeed, a critical daily maneuver, and the technique varied, depending on the type and size of your bustle. If you were sporting one of the softer, padded varieties, it might simply compress beneath you, offering a somewhat cushioned, if slightly lumpy, seat. However, the larger cage bustles of the 1880s, those impressive shelf-like structures, presented a more complex problem. Many were ingeniously designed to be at least partially collapsible. The famous Langtree bustle, for example, often featured hinged wires that allowed it to fold up somewhat when pressure was applied. You'd approach a chair with a degree of caution, perhaps perching delicately on the front edge, or learning to subtly guide the bustle to one side if its construction allowed. Sometimes, you'd simply have to sit on it, the structure hopefully resilient enough to withstand your weight without snapping any vital components. Imagine the silent terror of hearing a distinct twang from your posterior region as you gracefully, or so you thought, accepted a cup of tea, signaling a critical failure in your bustle's structural integrity. This wasn't an everyday occurrence, of course, as these items were built to last, but the fear of it must have lingered. It's a mainstream historical fact that furniture design in the Victorian era often took these fashionable impediments into account. You'll see conversation seats, those S-shaped sofas, which allowed two people to sit facing each other and converse without their voluminous skirts and bustles becoming hopelessly entangled. Many chairs intended for ladies had lower backs or were even backless, like ottomans or pofas, to better accommodate the posterior projection. It was a world designed, in part, around the well-dressed derriere. Now, what if your daily life involved more than just elegant repose and polite conversation? What about household chores? While many upper-class women who wore the most extravagant bustles had a retinue of servants to manage the household, middle-class women were also keen to follow fashion, albeit perhaps with slightly more practical, scaled-down versions of the bustle. Yet even a smaller bustle would have made tasks like bending over a wash basin, reaching for items on a high shelf, or working in the confines of a kitchen, a considerable challenge. You can picture the scene, trying to scrub a pot while your bustle bumps against the stove, or attempting to sweep the floor while your skirts trail dangerously close to the dustpan. Historians and social scientists continue to discuss the extent to which prevailing fashions, like the bustle, actively restricted women's participation in various forms of labor, versus how women ingeniously adapted their attire or their work methods to cope with such cumbersome garments. Perhaps aprons offered some measure of protection to the dress, but they wouldn't do much to alleviate the sheer awkwardness of the bustle itself during active work. Other daily activities also required careful management. Shopping trips meant navigating crowded stores, trying not to knock over displays with an errant sweep of your skirt. Dining involved sitting relatively upright at the table, hoping your bustle wasn't interfering with the person seated behind you. Even the most private moments, like using the necessary facilities, were complicated by the sheer volume of fabric. Those crotchless drawers we mentioned earlier were a genuine godsend in this regard, but you still had to manage multiple layers of petticoats and the dress skirt itself, and dancing. A Victorian ball must have been a mesmerizing swirl of color and fabric, but also a high-risk zone for collisions, with bustled skirts taking up considerable floor space. You'd need a skilled partner who understood the dynamics of dancing with a lady who had essentially her own gravitational field. One rather quirky, though sensible, tidbit related to preserving these elaborate outfits was the use of what were sometimes called bustle protectors or specific outdoor petticoats. These were simpler, washable covers or outer layers designed to shield the finer dress fabrics and the bustle itself from the dirt and grime of Victorian streets, especially on wet days. It was a practical solution to protect a significant investment. It's like trying to navigate a crowded festival today, but you're permanently wearing one of those oversized mascot costumes, the kind with a huge projecting tail. Good luck getting through the day unscathed, or without gently bumping into at least a dozen unsuspecting people. This daily dance with dress, this constant negotiation between your body, your clothing, and your environment, was a masterclass in adaptation, in learning to move with a constructed, artificial shape. But beyond the practicalities of simply getting from A to B without mishap, what about the underlying physics, the biomechanics of it all? How did these structures truly interact with the human form in motion? And what silent language did they speak about the women who wore them? So, you've learned to walk, to sit, however precariously, and to generally exist within your fashionable confines. But as you move through your day, a silent, complex interplay of physics and ergonomics is constantly at work between your body and the remarkable structure of your bustle. It wasn't just a passive lump of material, it was an active participant in your posture, your movement, and the very way you occupied space. Let's ponder for a moment the surprising mechanics of how these contraptions actually functioned. One of the first things you'd notice, or rather, your body would unconsciously adapt to, is the shift in your center of gravity. By adding volume and some weight, even if the bustle itself was relatively light, the fabric it supported wasn't predominantly to your posterior. Your natural balance point would be subtly altered, moved slightly backward, and perhaps a touch upward. This is where your loyal friend, the corset, played a crucial supporting role. The rigid S-curve posture, enforced by the corset, thrusting the chest forward and the hips back, actually helped to counterbalance the bustle's effect. You'd find yourself standing perhaps a little more upright through the torso, with your shoulders back, to compensate and maintain an elegant, stable equilibrium. It was a delicate internal negotiation of forces, often learned through practice until it became second nature. The materials themselves, as we've touched upon, were key to the bustle's mechanical success. Think of those watch springs, those strips of spring steel. Their genius lay in their resilience, their ability to flex under pressure, when you sat down, for instance, or brushed against a piece of furniture, and then, ideally, to spring back to their intended shape. Whalebone or baleen offered a similar combination of strength and elasticity. Cane and rattan provided lightweight frameworks. These weren't just dead materials, they possessed a kind underscore of stored energy, a responsiveness that allowed the bustle to have a life of its own, albeit a very controlled one. The cage-like structures, common in the more voluminous bustles, were a clever way to create maximum projection with a minimum of material and weight, distributing the load of the overlying skirts across multiple points. It's a principle you see in architecture and engineering, creating strong, voluminous forms through carefully arranged, relatively light components. Your bustle was, in essence, a small, wearable piece of cantilevered architecture, projecting quite dramatically from the anchor point of your waist. The late 19th century, it's worth remembering, was a period of significant innovation in material science and manufacturing. The Bessemer process, for example, had made steel more affordable and consistent, and advancements in working with metals were influencing everything from bridge building to, yes, the construction of ladies' undergarments. This industrial progress likely contributed to the increasing complexity and durability of bustles and corsets, allowing for designs that were both more intricate and more capable of withstanding the stresses of daily wear. This internal framework then had to interact harmoniously with the external fabrics of your dress. The bustle wasn't just about creating a bump, it was about providing a beautifully shaped foundation for the rich, heavy textiles popular in Victorian fashion. Without that underlying support, the elaborate pleats, drapes, and swags of fabric at the back of your skirt would simply collapse, dragging unattractively. The bustle lifted and sculpted this fabric, allowing it to cascade or puff out, just so, creating a platform for decorative bows, elaborate trains, and all manner of sartorial embellishments. There was a dynamic tension between the firm resilience of the bustle and the soft, flowing nature of the dress material that draped over it, a partnership that created the desired silhouette. When you walked, this partnership created its own particular kind of motion. The bustled skirt would often have a distinct sway or swing, a gentle undulation that could be quite mesmerizing. Was this entirely accidental, a mere byproduct of the mechanics, or was it a subtly cultivated effect, adding to the wearer's grace and allure, perhaps a bit of both? Different bustle designs would certainly have influenced this movement. A softer, padded bustle might produce a gentler sway, while a more rigid, sprung cage could create a more pronounced, almost buoyant, bounce. You can almost hear the sounds accompanying this movement: the soft rustle of silk petticoats over a cotton-covered frame, the faint, rhythmic creak of whalebone flexing, maybe even an occasional, discreet buoying if a spring was feeling particularly energetic. You might not have seen her enter the corridor, but you might have heard the subtle symphony of her underpinnings heralding her approach. Now, if we talk about ergonomics, the Victorian bustle probably wouldn't win any awards for user-friendliness. It was, for the most part, inherently awkward. Yet, there were clear attempts within the designs to mitigate some of this awkwardness. The collapsible features, the use of lighter materials where possible, the shaping designed to allow for some bodily movement without total structural failure. Ergonomic historians and costume theorists often ponder whether the discomfort and physical limitations imposed by garments like the bustle were simply accepted as the price of beauties and social conformity, or if there was a more complex negotiation where women found ways to assert agency and even carve out a degree of comfort or personal expression within these restrictive forms. One can only imagine the trial and error that must have gone into bustle design. The Patent Office archives, if one could rummage through the more speculative filings, might reveal some truly outlandish or ultimately failed bustle ideas. Perhaps a design that was far too rigid, transforming the wearer into an unbending statue, or one so overly sprung it threatened to launch her across the room with any sudden movement. Maybe there was even a prototype for a bustle with a tiny built-in cooling fan for sweltering summer afternoons, or another with tiny musical bells that tinkled with every step, delightful for a festive occasion perhaps, but probably relegated to the interesting but ultimately impractical category. It's a bit of a joke, of course, but innovation always has its share of developmental cul-de-sacs. It's like wearing a very firm, very large backpack, but it's mostly air and wire, and meticulously engineered to make you resemble a fashionable mythological creature, perhaps a centaur with an exceptionally well-draped hindquarter. The physics are, to our modern minds, quite perplexing, and the larger ones, some jest, probably had their own distinct microclimates. You might feel a pleasant breeze on your face, but goodness knows what atmospheric conditions were brewing in the bustling metropolis at your rear. So the bustle wasn't just a random assortment of wires and padding. It was a carefully engineered piece of personal architecture, a dynamic system that interacted with your body, your clothes, and your movement in a myriad of subtle and not so subtle ways. It shaped you, and you, in turn, learned to shape your movements to accommodate it. But beyond its physical presence, its springs and its framework, What did this extraordinary garment signify in the complex social theater of the Victorian era? What messages did it broadcast to the world? So, we've explored the ingenious, if somewhat perplexing, mechanics of the bustle, how it interacted with your body, and the very physics of your movement. It was, as we said, a piece of personal architecture. But this carefully engineered scaffolding for fabric did far more than just create a fashionable shape. It broadcast a series of powerful unspoken messages to everyone you encountered. In the complex social theater of the Victorian era, your bustle wasn't merely an item of clothing. It was a significant status symbol, a clear and immediate indicator of your place in the world. Throughout history, of course, what you wear has often been a shorthand for who you are, or at least who you aspire to be. But in the Victorian period, with its fairly rigid social hierarchies on one hand, and the exciting, sometimes unsettling, rise of new industrial wealth on the other, fashion took on a particularly potent role. For the established aristocracy, it was a way to affirm their traditional standing. For the burgeoning middle class and the nouveau riche, those who had made their fortunes in industry, trade, or finance, it was an indispensable tool for displaying their newfound prosperity and aspiring to a higher social rung. And the bustle, in all its impractical glory, was a perfect vehicle for such displays. You see, the very nature of a prominent bustle, especially when paired with the elaborate and often restrictive dresses of the time, screamed leisure. This is where the concept of conspicuous consumption, famously articulated by the economist and sociologist Thorstein Veblen around the turn of the 20th century, comes into play. Veblen argued that in societies with a distinct leisure class, items are often valued not just for their utility or beauty, but for their ability to demonstrate wealth through wasteful expenditure and the visible evidence of not needing to work. Your large bustle, your yards of expensive silk or velvet, the intricate trimmings that required hours of skilled labor, these were all prime examples. A woman encased in such an outfit clearly wasn't about to engage in manual labor. She wasn't scrubbing floors, tending a kitchen garden, or working a loom. Her attire signaled that her family could afford to keep her in a state of decorative idleness, or at least an idleness free from physical toil. The sheer impracticality became the point. It was the ultimate "look at me, I don't have to do any actual work" statement. If you could successfully navigate a crowded drawing room tea party without your bustle causing a domino effect of shattered porcelain figurines, you were clearly winning at the game of Victorian social display. Then there was the cost, not just of the dress itself, but of the entire ensemble, from the corset and multiple petticoats to the bustle contraption itself. Fashionable materials were expensive. Skilled dressmakers commanded high prices, and to maintain the look, you needed the time and resources for fittings, for upkeep, and often for the assistance of a lady's maid. The very act of getting dressed, as we've discussed, could be a lengthy, involved process, requiring help. This, too, was a subtle but clear indicator of wealth. You could afford personal staff. Your social standing could almost be measured by the sheer cantilever of your skirt and the number of hands required to assemble you each morning. Fashion, then as now, was also a restless beast, constantly changing. Silhouettes shifted, new trimmings came into vogue, and the ideal size and shape of the bustle itself evolved over its decades of popularity. Keeping up with these changes, being seen in the latest style, was another way to demonstrate that you had the disposable income and the social awareness to remain at the forefront of fashion. Fashion plates, in magazines like Godey's Lady's Book or the English Woman's Domestic Magazine, disseminated these trends, and there was considerable pressure, especially in urban centers and within aspiring social circles, to conform. To appear in an outdated bustle might suggest that your fortunes were fading or that you were simply out of touch. Of course, the expression of this status varied. While the ideal silhouette might be promoted from the top echelons of society, think Parisian haute couture filtering down, its adoption and adaptation would differ across classes. A wealthy society matron might sport a truly enormous bustle, made of the finest spring steel and covered in silk, supporting a gown dripping with expensive lace and beading. A middle-class woman, eager to be fashionable but with more limited means, might opt for a more modest-sized bustle, perhaps a patented design from a department store catalog, worn with a dress of good quality, wool or cotton, possibly made by a local dressmaker, or even by herself, with careful attention to the fashion plates. A working-class woman, if she embraced the trend at all, might achieve a similar, though much subdued, posterior fullness, with a simple homemade pad, or a few extra ruffles on her petticoat, her dress made of sturdy, practical fabric. Social historians continue to explore the nuances of how fashion trends like the bustle were adopted and adapted across different socio-economic strata, debating whether it was primarily a top-down imposition of elite styles, or if there was more agency and variation in how fashion was interpreted and expressed by women of different backgrounds. The bustle and its accompanying attire also played a role in defining and reinforcing contemporary notions of femininity and respectability. The S-curve silhouette, achieved through the combined efforts of the corset and bustle, was the visual ideal of womanhood for a significant portion of the Victorian era. It emphasized a tiny waist, rounded hips, and a prominent posterior, features considered alluring and appropriately feminine. To present oneself in this manner was to align with societal expectations of how a respectable lady should appear. One can almost imagine a subtle, perhaps even second-hand, market for these fashion essentials. Thrifty mothers might have guided their daughters on how to cleverly update last season's dress improver with a bit of extra horsehair padding or some judicious restitching of tapes, because keeping up with the dictates of Paris, or even just the local arbiters of style, was a continuous and often costly endeavor. Perhaps, too, the size and extravagance of one's bustle subtly shifted with age or marital status, a young debutante sporting a slightly more demure version, while a grand, established society hostess might display a more commanding and voluminous posterior statement. It was a language understood by all, even if not everyone could afford to speak it fluently. Think of it like luxury cars or designer handbags today. The brand, the model, the perceived newness all transmit signals about wealth and taste. The Victorian bustle was doing precisely that, but it was attached to and shaping your very person. So, the bustle was far more than a mere fashion whim, far more than an arbitrary decision to emphasize one part of the anatomy. It was a potent symbol, a complex cultural artifact woven into the very fabric of Victorian society. It was a declaration of status, a marker of leisure, an emblem of respectability, and a key player in the ongoing performance of social identity. But what exactly was the aesthetic ideal it was striving to achieve with such dedication and engineering? What was this S-shaped, backward-projecting silhouette all about in terms of the beauty standards and artistic sensibilities of the time? So your bustle wasn't just a random puff of fabric at your back, nor was it solely a telegraph of your social standing, though it certainly excelled at that. It was a crucial component, a veritable keystone in the intricate architectural project of achieving the era's most fashionable female silhouette, the celebrated and sometimes criticized S-curve. This was the aesthetic ideal that Victorian women, or at least those aspiring to high fashion, dedicated considerable effort, expense, and engineering to achieve. But what exactly was this S-curve, and what extreme lengths were considered perfectly normal in its pursuit? Imagine, if you will, a figure viewed from the side. You'd see a chest pushed prominently forward, creating the top curve of the Sioux. This was often enhanced, not just by posture, but also by the cut of the bodice, and sometimes by bust improvers, padded inserts, or ruffled chemisettes, designed to give a fuller, more rounded appearance to the bosom. Then, the waist would be cinched dramatically inward, creating that enviably tiny circumference, the deep inward curve of our Sioux. This, of course, was the domain of the mighty corset, laced with impressive determination. And finally, the pièce de résistance, the bustle, would thrust the hips and posterior sharply backward and often upward, creating the lower outward curve of the Sioux, before the skirts then cascaded elegantly to the floor, perhaps even trailing into a train. It was a silhouette of dramatic contrasts, the full bosom, the tiny waist, the prominent derriere. This was considered the pinnacle of feminine allure for a significant portion of the Victorian age. Now, achieving this specific shape wasn't simply a matter of tying on a bustle and calling it a day. Oh no, it was a symphony of underpinnings working in concert, a masterclass in sartorial sculpting. The corset, as we've mentioned, was absolutely fundamental. It didn't just narrow the waist. Its rigid structure and tight lacing helped to push the bust upwards and forwards, and tilted the pelvis slightly, setting the stage for the bustle to complete the S shape, without the corset creating that defined, nipped-in waist and altering the torso's posture. The bustle's effect would have been diminished, perhaps looking more like a random lump than a deliberate curve. Women endured considerable compression, their breathing often restricted, all in the name of that coveted wasp waist, which was the centerpiece of the S-curve. And as mentioned, padding wasn't exclusively reserved for the rear. If nature hadn't blessed you with the fashionably full bosom depicted in the style plates, well, there were solutions for that too. Various forms of bust improvers, or falsies, made from materials ranging from padded cotton to starched ruffles, and even in some more experimental cases, inflatable rubber could be strategically placed within the bodice to achieve the desired voluptuousness at the front, balancing the protuberance at the back. It's like today's contouring makeup, but for your entire torso and posterior, using steel, whalebone, and fabric instead of bronzer and highlighter. Talk about commitment to the look. The dressmaking itself was an art form, meticulously tailored to work in harmony with these understructures. Bodices were often heavily boned, even beyond the corset, to maintain their shape and smooth lines over the torso. Skirts were cut with voluminous amounts of fabric, especially at the back, and ingeniously draped, pleated, and sometimes even weighted with lead pellets in the hems to ensure they fell perfectly over the bustle, accentuating its projection and creating that graceful sweep. But why this particular shape? What were the influences that led to the S-curve becoming the dominant aesthetic? Art historians and fashion theorists continue to analyze whether the Victorian S-curve silhouette, with its reliance on corsetry and bustles, was primarily a reflection of male aesthetic desires imposed upon women, or if women themselves actively participated in and derived satisfaction from achieving this culturally sanctioned form of beauty. Some suggest it was a romanticized ideal of femininity, emphasizing fragility with the tiny waist, yet hinting at maturity and potential fertility with the accentuated bust and hips, albeit an artificially sculpted version of them. It was certainly a departure from the more columnar, high-waisted empire silhouette of the early 19th century, and perhaps, like many fashion cycles, it was partly a reaction against what came before. The Victorian era also saw a strong cult of domesticity, and some argue that such elaborate and somewhat restrictive clothing reinforced the image of women as ornamental figures, best suited to the domestic sphere rather than the rough and tumble of public life or strenuous activity. Interestingly, this highly artificial ideal didn't go unchallenged even in its own time. The aesthetic dress movement, which gained traction in the latter decades of the 19th century, actively campaigned against the tyranny of corsets and bustles. Proponents like Jane Morris and figures associated with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood advocated for looser, uncorseted garments, inspired by medieval robes and classical drapery, prioritizing comfort, natural lines, and artistic expression over contrived fashionable shapes. This very movement underscores just how dominant, and to some oppressive, the mainstream S-curve ideal had become. The extreme lengths women went to achieve and maintain this look were considerable. There was the undeniable physical discomfort, the restricted breathing, the sheer weight of the multiple layers of clothing, the difficulty in performing simple movements. There was the significant investment of time and effort required for the daily ritual of dressing and undressing. And of course, there was the financial cost of acquiring and maintaining such a wardrobe. Yet, despite these drawbacks, the dedication to the S-curve was unwavering for many, a testament to the power of fashion and societal expectation. Alongside the corsets and bustles themselves, you'd even find advertisements in ladies' magazines for peculiar home exercise contraptions or specific calisthenic routines, all promising to help train your figure into the perfect S shape. One can only imagine ladies hopefully performing a series of mild contortions with a broom handle or diligently practicing a graceful posture exercise, all in pursuit of that fashionable ideal. Getting that perfect S-curve must have felt like trying to sculpt jelly with a hammer and chisel, sometimes a constant battle between the realities of human anatomy and fashion's grand, often unforgiving, vision. The bustle, then, was a key instrument in this pursuit of an overtly artificial, highly stylized form of beauty. It wasn't about subtly enhancing nature, it was about dramatically reshaping it, creating a silhouette that was both a product of its time and a fascinating example of how far we'll go to embody an ideal. Achieving this sculpted ideal was an art form in itself, a daily dedication to structure and artifice. But as with any complex construction, especially one worn on a moving human body, things didn't always go according to plan. Sometimes, the pursuit of the perfect silhouette could lead to some rather memorable and occasionally comical mishaps and misadventures. Achieving that perfect S-curve, that sculpted ideal of Victorian femininity, was indeed an art form, a daily exercise in structural engineering upon one's own person. But as any architect or engineer will tell you, even the most carefully designed constructions can encounter unforeseen issues, especially when they're expected to move and interact with a dynamic environment. And so it was with the bustle. Despite the ingenuity of their design and the dedication of their wearers, things didn't always go according to the fashion plate. Sometimes, in the pursuit of that perfect posterior projection, the bustle could, shall we say, develop a mind of its own, leading to some rather memorable, and often quite comical, mishaps and misadventures. Prepare yourself for a few tales of when bustles decided to, well, attack. Imagine yourself at a sophisticated soiree, feeling the epitome of elegance in your finest silk, your bustle creating just the right fashionable swell beneath your skirts. You're engaged in witty repartee, perhaps delicately sipping some punch, when suddenly you feel a subtle shift, a disconcerting give from your nether regions. 1 minute you're the belle of the ball, the next your bustle is making a bid for freedom and heading south for the winter, or at least significantly altering its altitude. A broken spring, a snapped tape, or a series of failing stitches could lead to the dreaded bustle collapse, resulting in a lopsided silhouette or a general deflation that could be mortifying in a crowded room. You might try to subtly coax it back into position, or if you were lucky, a discreet friend or a sharp-eyed lady's maid might notice your plight and engineer a swift retreat for emergency repairs. Then there were the environmental hazards. Your bustle, particularly the more voluminous ones, essentially gave you an extended personal radius, one you had to be constantly aware of. Navigating a room filled with delicate Victorian bric-a-brac was like being a bull in a china shop, albeit a very well-dressed bull. A careless turn, a misjudged step, and you could send a precious porcelain shepherdess flying, or sweep a collection of silver spoons clattering to the floor. Door handles seemed to possess a magnetic attraction for the wire cages, snagging them with infuriating regularity, and narrow passages, or crowded omnibuses. These were obstacle courses that tested your agility and patience to their limits. Some hostesses probably considered investing in wider doorways and specially reinforced chairs just for the bustle season. It was either that or face a consistently high bill for incidental damages. Even the simple act of sitting, as we've touched upon, could be fraught with peril. If your collapsible bustle decided not to collapse as intended, you might find yourself perched precariously on the very edge of your seat, or worse, being gently but firmly propelled forward as if from a low-powered catapult. A sudden, unexpected boing or sproing from beneath your skirts during a quiet moment in church, as a critical spring decided to unspring itself, was probably not conducive to pious contemplation and could elicit a few stifled giggles from nearby pews. And imagine the awkwardness of trying to extricate yourself from a chair that seemed to have formed an unholy alliance with your bustle's framework, trapping you in a seated embrace. Wardrobe malfunctions took on a whole new dimension. A bustle that shifted significantly out of place under your dress could create some truly bizarre and unflattering lumps and bumps, far from the graceful curve you'd so painstakingly assembled earlier. Petticoats could get tangled within the wire structures, creating a knotted mess that restricted movement and felt incredibly awkward. It's like that recurring nightmare where you realize you've gone to work or school in your pajamas, but instead, your carefully concealed underpinnings have decided to stage a very public and rather unruly protest. Awkward level. Victorian extreme. Periodical illustrations and satirical cartoons of the time, especially in magazines like Britain's Punch, absolutely reveled in depicting these sorts of bustle-related blunders. You'd see caricatures of women getting stuck in doorways, their bustles comically exaggerated, or gentlemen tripping over unseen trains propelled by enormous bustles. These images provide a wonderfully vivid, if perhaps slightly exaggerated, historical record of the everyday comedy and inconvenience the fashion could entail. While cultural historians debate the actual frequency and severity of such incidents versus the tendency of satire to exaggerate for comedic effect, and how these portrayals may have shaped public perception of the fashion, there's little doubt that these garments presented genuine daily challenges. One can only imagine the silent, frantic signals that might have passed between a lady in distress and her maid, or a close confidant. Perhaps a discreet cough, a specific, urgent flutter of the fan, or a particular raised eyebrow communicated a bustle breach, prompting a swift, strategic withdrawal to a lady's retiring room for emergency repairs. Did Victorian ladies carry tiny secret bustle first aid kits in their reticules, equipped with safety pins and a needle and thread for just such an occasion? It's a rather charming, if speculative, notion. One quirky tidbit, often anecdotally shared, is the fascination pets, particularly mischievous cats, might have had for these strange rustling contraptions, perhaps seeing a stored bustle as a new kind of climbing frame or a delightful toy to bat at when worn. Recovering from such a mishap with grace and poise was the true test of a Victorian lady's social training. A stifled blush, a quick apology if property was damaged, and an attempt to carry on as if nothing untoward had occurred were the order of the day. After all, in a society that placed such a high premium on decorum, drawing further attention to one's sartorial misfortune was simply not done. These comical calamities and awkward encounters were for the most part fleeting embarrassments, the stuff of amusing anecdotes whispered behind fans or chuckled over in private. They were the minor skirmishes in the daily battle for fashion, but beyond the potential for social mortification and the occasional property damage, what about the more persistent, day-to-day impact of these structures on a woman's physical health and overall comfort? That, my friends, is a slightly less amusing side of the story. Those comical mishaps and awkward social stumbles we chuckled about were for the most part fleeting moments of embarrassment in a Victorian lady's life. A lopsided bustle or a snagged skirt could usually be rectified, a blush could fade, but beyond these occasional public indignities, there was a more persistent, less amusing side to the story of the bustle. The day-to-day impact it, along with its inseparable companion, the corset, had on a woman's physical health and simple creature comfort, or, more accurately, the distinct lack thereof. Imagine, if you will, the sheer physical burden. It wasn't just the bustle itself, though some of the larger wire cages or heavily padded horsehair constructions had a noticeable heft. It was the cumulative weight of the entire ensemble, your camise, drawers, stockings, the formidable corset, then the bustle, followed by multiple petticoats, perhaps one or two of sturdy cotton, maybe a flannel one in winter, and then a decorative one to ensure the dress fell just so. And finally, the dress itself, often made of heavy materials like wool, velvet, or richly embroidered silk. All this weight was primarily supported by your waist, already cinched and constricted by the corset, and your hips. You can almost feel the dull ache that might have settled into your lower back by the end of a long day, the weary drag on your shoulders. Then there was the heat, trapped beneath all those layers, with a structure at your back that hardly encouraged airflow. You'd often find yourself in your own personal microclimate, and not usually a refreshing one. In the summer months, or in stuffy, gas-lit ballrooms, crowded with other similarly attired individuals, the warmth could become stifling. Skin irritations and chafing were common companions, particularly where the tapes of the bustle or the boning of the corset pressed relentlessly against your skin. It's like wearing your heaviest winter coat, plus a loaded hiking backpack that only sticks out oddly at the back, and a very tight weightlifting belt, all day, every day, even indoors, and then being expected to look effortlessly graceful. That's just a typical Tuesday afternoon for you in, say, 1885. Your movement, as we've discussed, was certainly restricted for the sake of the silhouette, making even simple physical activities more strenuous than they needed to be. But this restriction could also translate into specific physical complaints. The forward tilt of the torso, enforced by the corset, to achieve the S-curve in conjunction with the bustle, combined with the bustle's own projection and weight, could undoubtedly place considerable strain on the muscles of your lower back and abdomen. Pressure points were almost inevitable, where the rigid framework of the bustle or the unyielding pads pressed against your flesh for hours on end. This could lead to soreness, tenderness, and perhaps even bruising in more sensitive individuals, or with particularly unforgiving bustle designs. While the corset is more famously and directly implicated in concerns about internal organ compression and restricted breathing, it's important to remember that the bustle was part of this overall restrictive fashion package. It added to the general encumbrance and contributed to an environment where your body was constantly being molded and constrained. Hygiene, too, could be a concern. Keeping so many layers of underclothing meticulously clean, especially in an era before modern laundry detergents and washing machines, was a significant undertaking. Insufficiently aired or cleaned garments, worn close to the body in warm conditions, could potentially lead to skin problems. It's a mainstream historical fact that these concerns were not lost on contemporary observers. The dress reform movement, which gained momentum from the mid to late 19th century, was vocal in its criticism of prevailing fashions, particularly tight lacing and heavy, restrictive skirts, supported by contraptions like bustles and crinolines. Physicians and health advocates of the time often wrote about the perceived negative impacts of such clothing on women's health, citing issues like impeded circulation, digestive troubles, and muscular weakness. Figures like Dr. Gustav Jaeger promoted his sanitary woolen clothing system, and others advocated for rational dress, garments that were lighter, looser, and allowed for greater freedom of movement. They championed clothing that conformed to the body, rather than forcing the body to conform to an artificial ideal. Medical historians and scholars of gender studies continue to investigate the complex relationship between Victorian women's fashion, their reported physical ailments, and the prevailing medical understanding of female physiology. They debate how much discomfort or illness was directly attributable to clothing versus other societal factors like limited exercise, poor sanitation in cities, or restrictive diets, and how the medical discourse of the time itself shaped perceptions of female health. Of course, women sought ways to find some measure of comfort. However small, you might opt for a smaller, lighter morning bustle for wear around the house, reserving your grandest, most formidable posterior projection for important social calls or evening events. Manufacturers, ever keen to appeal to a desire for comfort, or at least less discomfort, sometimes marketed health bustles or ventilated bustles, often with dubious claims of improved airflow or ergonomic design. You can almost picture the advertisements. Try the new Featherlight bustle, all the fashion, half the fatigue. Results may vary, may still cause existential despair on particularly warm days. Pure speculation, of course, but the desire for relief must have been palpable. Perhaps there was an unspoken code of leaning against mantelpieces in a particular elegant way, not just for dramatic effect or to show off your train, but to surreptitiously give your weary bustle springs and your aching back a brief, blessed moment of respite. And oh, the profound, almost spiritual relief you must have felt at the end of the day, when, with the help of your maid, or perhaps struggling on your own, you finally unhooked the last tape, unlaced the corset, and shed the layers. That first deep, unrestricted breath, the feeling of your spine remembering its natural alignment. It must have been a moment of pure, unadulterated bliss. You'd probably develop a very specific bustle sigh, that little exhalation of pure relief when freedom was finally achieved. Despite these very real discomforts and the shadow of potential health concerns, the allure of the fashionable silhouette, with the bustle as its indispensable supporting actor, held powerful sway for several decades. The desire to be seen as elegant, as respectable, as a woman of standing, often overrode considerations of mere physical ease. But fashion, as we know, is never truly static. It ebbs and flows, constantly reinventing itself. So how did this remarkable, and sometimes rather ruthless, garment change and evolve during its reign at the rear of Victorian style? Despite the litany of discomforts, the potential for public mishaps, and the sheer daily effort involved, the reign of the bustle was surprisingly long and remarkably dynamic. This wasn't a static, unchanging fashion. Oh no, the bustle, like a restless creature, constantly reinvented itself, morphing in size, shape, and structural complexity throughout its time in the sartorial spotlight. So, let's trace this fascinating evolution of exaggeration, this journey of the ever-changing posterior landscape that kept Victorian ladies and their dressmakers on their toes. You can broadly divide the bustle's high fashion dominance into two main acts, with a curious, almost bustleless interlude in between. Think of it as a dramatic play. Act 1, the rise and flourish, a brief intermission where everyone catches their breath and tries a sleeker look, and then Act 2, the triumphant and arguably more extreme return. These periods are roughly demarcated as the first bustle era, from about 1869 to 1876, the natural form or princess line interlude from around 1877 to 1882, and the second, often more pronounced bustle period from 1883 up to about 1889 or even 1890. Of course, fashion changes are rarely neat and tidy, so you'd see a lot of gradual transitions and overlapping styles rather than abrupt switches on January 1st of a given year. Let's rewind to Act 1, the late 1860s and early 1870s. Here the bustle, often referred to by the charming French term tournure, emerged as a softer, more rounded affair. Imagine the fullness starting relatively high on your back, just below your tightly cinched waist, and then cascading downwards, often supporting skirts that flowed into elegant trains. The effect was less of a sudden shelf and more of a graceful sloping curve, sometimes likened to a waterfall of fabric. The bustles themselves reflected this softer ideal. You'd find substantial padded cushions filled with horsehair or down, or perhaps crinolines, essentially small crinolines that concentrated their hooped structure solely at the back. Sometimes, the bustle effect was achieved through layers of stiffened ruffles built into the petticoat or the dress skirt itself. Your dresses from this period would feature elaborately draped and pleated fabrics, like rich silk taffetas that could hold their shape and produce that delightful rustle as you moved, all artfully arranged over this supportive foundation. It was a look of opulent flowing curves. Then, as the 1870s drew to a close, a dramatic shift occurred. It was as if fashion collectively sighed and decided to take a break from all that posterior extravagance. During this interlude, roughly 1877 to 1882, the bustle virtually disappeared. Skirts deflated at the back and became much narrower, clinging closely to your hips and thighs, before often flaring out into long, elegant trains that trailed like a mermaid's tail. This was the era of the natural form, or the princess line. The silhouette became incredibly elongated and slender, emphasizing a very smooth long torso. Your corset, of course, was working overtime here. While a very small pad or dress improver might still be discreetly employed to prevent the skirt fabric from clinging ungracefully, any significant projection was decidedly out. It's a mainstream historical fact that the princess line dress, which became immensely popular during these years, was typically cut in long-shaped panels running from shoulder to hem without a horizontal waist seam. This design hugged the figure closely and was entirely unsuited to being worn over a large bustle. It was a very sophisticated, albeit highly restrictive look. Fashion magazines of the time would sometimes show rather tentative hybrid styles during this period, a sort of bustle in waiting, hinting that the prominent posterior was merely biding its time for a grand re-entrance. And re-enter it did, with an almost theatrical flourish, for Act Two, kicking off around 1883. If you thought the first bustle was something, its second coming was even more determined to make a statement. The bustles of the 1880s were often significantly larger, more angular, and sat much higher and more horizontally on your back. This created that distinctive, shelf-like appearance that has become the most iconic and perhaps most caricatured image of the Victorian bustle. Some contemporary humorists even likened the silhouette to that of a centaur. You'd be forgiven for thinking designers had shares in steel companies during this second bustle boom. The structures underpinning this look were marvels of engineering, or perhaps over-engineering. Complex wire cages, like the well-known Langtree bustle, became common, often featuring articulated joints, springs, and adjustable tapes to achieve the desired projection and a modicum of flexibility. Whalebone and cane were also used extensively to create these almost architectural forms. Your dresses during this time would have bodices that were even more severely tailored and fitted, while the skirts jutted out quite sharply at the back to accommodate the pronounced understructure. Interestingly, the hemlines at the front of skirts sometimes became a little shorter, occasionally even revealing a daring glimpse of your ankles, while the back remained voluminous and often trained. The overall effect was more aggressive, more overtly artificial, and undeniably more exaggerated than its earlier incarnation. You could almost chart a woman's dedication to high fashion by the assertive angle and sheer cantilever of her bustle. Fashion historians and curators often debate the precise catalysts for these rather dramatic shifts in style. Was it the whim of influential Parisian couturiers like Charles Frederick Worth, whose designs were eagerly copied, or perhaps the demands of textile manufacturers seeking new ways to showcase their elaborate fabrics? Or was it a broader cultural shift in aesthetic preferences, a collective desire among women themselves for novelty and a new way to express their modernity and status? It was likely a complex interplay of all these factors. This constant reinvention of the posterior landscape certainly kept dressmakers on their toes and fashion critics, both admiring and satirical, endlessly supplied with material. But amidst all this feminine focus on achieving the perfect, evolving backside, what did the gentlemen of the era actually make of these shifting shapes and ever more prominent projections? Were they universally charmed, utterly bewildered, or perhaps even a little bit intimidated by these formidable fashion statements? The ever-shifting, often bewildering, landscape of the Victorian bustle certainly kept dressmakers innovating and fashion magazines filled with the latest pronouncements from Paris. You, as a fashionable lady, were deeply immersed in this world, navigating its demands and perhaps enjoying its aesthetic rewards. But what of the other half of society? What did the gentlemen of the era truly make of these exaggerated feminine forms, these posterior prominences that grew, shrank, and then grew again with such fashionable fervor? Their perspectives, as you might imagine, were likely as varied and complex as the bustle contraptions themselves, a mix of admiration, amusement, bewilderment, and perhaps even a touch of practical exasperation. It's important to remember that there wasn't a single monolithic male view on the bustle. A doting husband, helping to finance his wife's fashionable wardrobe, might have seen it as a delightful enhancement of her charms and a reflection of his own success. A young suitor, encountering these formidable structures in drawing rooms and at dances, might have been both intimidated and intrigued. A father might have grumbled good-naturedly, or perhaps not so good-naturedly, about the expense, and a writer or cartoonist for a satirical journal most certainly saw a rich vein of humor to be mined. For many men, the bustle, as an integral part of the era's dominant feminine ideal, was undoubtedly attractive. The S-curve silhouette, with its tiny waist, full bosom, and prominent posterior, was culturally coded as beautiful and desirable. The bustle played a key role in sculpting this ideal, accentuating features considered quintessentially feminine. You can imagine many a gentleman admiring the graceful sway of a bustled skirt, the way it emphasized the turn of a waist, or the sheer artistry of a beautifully draped gown over its supportive underpinnings. The very artifice and dedication to appearance could, in itself, be seen as alluring, a sign of a lady's refinement and attention to the niceties of social presentation. However, this admiration often coexisted with a healthy dose of bewilderment and amusement. The sheer artificiality and often extreme exaggeration of the bustle, particularly in its later, more shelf-like incarnations, lent itself readily to caricature. And indeed, satirical publications of the day, which were largely written and consumed by men, had a field day with the bustle. It's a mainstream historical fact that magazines like Britain's Punch or America's Harper's Weekly frequently featured cartoons lampooning the fashion. You'd see drawings of women struggling to navigate doorways, their bustles comically oversized, or gentlemen being inadvertently poked or prodded by these projecting structures. These humorous depictions suggest a certain detachment, perhaps a playful lack of comprehension regarding the serious business of female fashion, and an enjoyment in highlighting its more absurd aspects. Beyond mere amusement, there were also practical considerations and occasional annoyances from a male perspective. Imagine trying to escort a lady down a crowded pavement when her bustled skirts took up a significant portion of the available space. A gentleman probably developed excellent peripheral vision and the nimble footwork of a dancer to avoid unfortunate collisions or treading on expensive fabric. Dancing itself must have presented unique challenges, requiring a careful negotiation of personal space to avoid entanglements. And what about the simple act of sitting together in a carriage, or in the somewhat cramped confines of a theater box? A large bustle was not conducive to cozy proximity. You can almost hear a long-suffering husband sighing as he tried to find a comfortable position on a sofa already dominated by his wife's fashionable posterior. A gentleman escorting a fully bustled lady, one might quip, probably needed the strategic mind of a military general just to plan a route through a well-furnished room. Then there was the expense. While a wealthy man might take pride in his wife's or daughter's ability to keep up with the latest costly fashions, the constant demand for new dresses, new trimmings, and indeed, new bustles as styles evolved, could be a source of financial strain, or at least a topic for good-natured complaint. This trope of the fashion-obsessed wife and the beleaguered, bill-paying husband was a common one in Victorian humor. Some men, particularly social critics or those with a more intellectual bent, viewed extreme fashions, like the bustle, with a more critical eye. They might see them as symbols of frivolity, irrationality, or an unhealthy preoccupation with mere outward appearance. Echoing some of the concerns of the dress reformers, they might question the logic of enduring such discomfort and restriction for the sake of a fleeting trend, associating it with a certain perceived flightiness or lack of serious purpose in women. Literary scholars and social historians sometimes analyze depictions of men's reactions to bustled women in Victorian literature, personal diaries, and letters to gauge the extent to which these garments influenced courtship rituals and intimate interactions. They debate whether these elaborate structures were seen more as alluring enhancements that heightened erotic appeal through mystery and suggestion, or as physical and symbolic barriers that maintained a formal distance, trying to offer a heartfelt embrace to your beloved when she was encased in a formidable 1880s shelf. Bustle must have been something of an engineering challenge in itself, perhaps like attempting to hug a small, elegantly upholstered, but rather unyielding, piece of furniture, romantic in its own particular Victorian way, no doubt. You can almost imagine a curmudgeonly letter to the editor of the Times, or a similar publication, perhaps penned by a perplexed husband of any town, complaining about the latest shipment of steel his wife required for her newfangled dress improver, or the impossibility of finding a moment's peace without tripping over a trailing skirt. These little human frustrations and bewilderments are often what bring a historical period to life. It's like how some people today might be simultaneously fascinated and utterly baffled by certain complex modern fashion trends or elaborate beauty rituals. Some things, it seems, are destined to remain a delightful, if somewhat perplexing, mystery across the genders. So, the male gaze upon the Victorian bustle was a complex tapestry, woven with threads of admiration for the fashionable ideal, amusement at its excesses, and a dash of everyday exasperation at its practical inconveniences. But this naturally leads to a crucial question. While gentlemen were observing, commenting, and occasionally satirizing, were all women equally enthusiastic converts to the cult of the bustle? Or were there, perhaps, whispers of dissent, quiet acts of sartorial rebellion, or alternative paths sought by those who found the prevailing fashionable silhouette just a bit too much to bear? The gentlemen of the Victorian era, as we've discovered, cast a varied gaze upon the ever-evolving bustle, sometimes admiring, often amused, and occasionally a tad exasperated by its fashionable dictates. But this inevitably prompts us to turn our attention back to you, the Victorian lady, and to ask, were you and all your sisters truly unanimous in your devotion to this cult of the cantilevered posterior? Or beneath the rustle of silk and the creak of whalebone, were there whispers of dissent, quiet acts of sartorial rebellion, or perhaps more comfortable, alternative paths sought by those who found the fashionable silhouette, with all its attendant machinery, just a little too much to bear? It's probably safe to say that not every woman embraced the most extreme manifestations of the bustle with equal, unbridled enthusiasm. Your acceptance, or indeed your resistance, would likely have been shaped by a multitude of factors. Your age, for instance. Perhaps as a very young woman, or an older one, you might have favored a more subdued version. Your social class and occupation, if you had one, would certainly have played a significant role. A shop girl or a governess, even if aspiring to fashion, would have by necessity adopted a more practical version than a lady of leisure whose main occupation was social calls and balls. your personal comfort threshold, your access to the latest Parisian fads, and indeed your individual personality, all these would have colored your relationship with the bustle. So what forms did this bustle rebellion, if we can call it that, actually take? Often it wasn't a dramatic placard-waving protest in the streets, but something far more subtle. For many, it might have simply meant choosing smaller, more practical bustle pads for everyday wear, reserving the larger, more elaborate cage structures for truly special occasions. Or perhaps you, or your clever dressmaker, would adapt the fashionable patterns, skillfully reducing the bustle's extremity while still giving a polite nod to the prevailing line, so you didn't look completely out of sync. Yes, I have a bustle, your attire might whisper, but it's a sensible one, thank you very much, one that allows me to fetch a book from the top shelf without deploying a small team of engineers. Then there were the more organized and vocal challenges to restrictive Victorian dress, most notably from the dress reform movement. And it's crucial here to highlight the female voices that were central to this cause. The Rational Dress Society, for instance, was founded in London in 1881 by prominent women like Viscountess Harberton and Mrs. E. M. King. Their arguments were clear and compelling. They advocated for clothing that prioritized health, comfort, and freedom of movement over the arbitrary dictates of fashion. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Rational Dress Society proposed that women's clothing should follow the natural lines of the body, weigh no more than 7 pounds in total, a stark contrast to the many pounds of a fully bustled and corseted ensemble, and crucially, not exert undue pressure on any vital organ. This was a direct reasoned challenge to the tight-lacing corsetry and the heavy, cumbersome, bustled skirts of the day. They championed alternatives like looser garments and even, quite controversially for the time, divided skirts or bifurcated garments, which were an early modest form of trousers for women, designed to allow for activities like cycling. Alongside this, you had the aesthetic dress movement. Women connected with artistic circles, such as those associated with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, like Jane Morris, adopted styles that were a world away from the stiff S-curve. They favored looser, uncorseted gowns made from soft, flowing fabrics, often inspired by medieval art, classical drapery, or non-Western clothing. Their aim was artistic expression and a more natural, harmonious relationship between the body and clothing. You can imagine the sheer relief, the delightful sense of liberation for a woman choosing to embrace such a style, to feel fabric drape and move with her body rather than forcing her body into a rigid, artificial shape. Opting out of the bustle, and especially the corset, probably felt like acquiring a minor superpower, the ability to sit comfortably on any chair, to navigate any doorway with ease, and even to bend over without requiring a prior structural integrity check of your underpinnings. The rise of women's participation in sports, particularly towards the end of the 19th century, also played a role. Activities like lawn tennis, archery, and especially cycling simply couldn't be performed gracefully or safely in highly restrictive, bustled attire. This necessitated the development of more practical sporting wear, which, while often still quite modest by our standards, began to normalize the idea of women in less encumbering clothes, at least for specific activities. The safety bicycle, with its demand for shorter skirts or divided garments, was a particularly powerful agent of change. However, daring to defy mainstream fashion was no small undertaking. The social pressure to conform was immense. If you chose to step out in a rational gown or an aesthetic robe, you risked ridicule, being labeled as eccentric, unfeminine, or even morally suspect. Imagine the scandalized whispers if a lady attended a garden party with a noticeably absent bustle, Did you see Mrs. Abernathy, my dear, quite flat at the back? Positively revolutionary, or perhaps she simply forgot a vital component this morning. It would be the talk of the town for weeks. Finding alternative ready-made clothing could also be a challenge for a long time, meaning such choices often required access to specialized dressmakers or considerable sewing skills of your own. Social historians and fashion theorists actively debate the true extent and impact of these dress rebellions. Were they widespread movements significantly challenging mainstream Victorian gender roles, or were they more niche expressions of individuality, largely confined to intellectual, artistic, or upper-class reformist circles? It's likely a bit of both, but they undeniably planted seeds of change and offered visible alternatives, however limited their initial uptake. Some women probably just had a private sick of this nonsense day, left the bustle on its stand by the bedpost, and reveled in the scandalous freedom of a naturally shaped posterior, much to the confusion of their pet cat, who might have considered that wire cage its prime afternoon napping spot. So while the image of the universally bustled Victorian lady is a powerful one, it's important to remember these currents of resistance, adaptation, and outright rebellion. The desire for comfort, practicality, and a more natural form was a persistent whisper beneath the dominant roar of high fashion. But how was this dominant fashion, and the occasional, daring deviations from it, portrayed and perceived in the wider cultural sphere through the illustrations, photographs, and writings of the day? The Victorian bustle, in its various forms and evolutions, was far more than just a personal undergarment or a private struggle for comfort and style. It was a public statement, a highly visible component of the feminine silhouette, and as such, it was endlessly documented, discussed, admired, and yes, frequently lampooned in the burgeoning popular culture of the day. From the glossy aspirations of fashion plates to the sharp satire of cartoonists and the stoic gaze of early photography, the bustle was very much in the limelight. If you were a Victorian lady keen to stay abreast of the latest styles and what properly fashionable lady wasn't, your first port of call would likely be the beautifully produced fashion plates in ladies' magazines. Publications like America's Godey's Ladies' Book or Harper's Bazaar or Britain's The Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine and The Queen were your windows into the world of high fashion. Here you'd see meticulously hand-colored illustrations depicting elegant women in the most current modes, their bustles forming the perfect, idealized foundation for exquisitely draped gowns. These images were pure aspiration, the figures often elongated, their waists impossibly tiny, their bustles creating a flawless, graceful sweep. There were no awkward mishaps or uncomfortable realities here, just serene elegance. These magazines not only showcased the what, but also the how, often including sewing patterns and detailed descriptions, guiding you in your quest to replicate these desirable looks and reinforcing the bustle's place as an essential component of chic. But for every idealized fashion plate, there was likely a satirical cartoon offering a rather different perspective. This was the golden age of illustrated satirical journals, and the bustle, with its inherent potential for exaggeration and awkwardness, was a comedic gift that kept on giving. Publications like Punch in the United Kingdom, or Puck and Judge in the United States, were filled with witty, often biting caricatures of contemporary life, and fashion fads were a favorite target. The mainstream historical fact is that the rise of these popular illustrated magazines, fueled by advancements in printing technology like lithography and steam-powered presses, meant that such images, both the fashionable and the satirical, could reach an unprecedentedly wide audience, shaping public perception across different social classes. In these cartoons, You'd see bustles blown up to hilariously impractical proportions, women getting stuck in doorways, knocking over unfortunate gentlemen, or compared to all manner of unlikely objects, from snails' shells to overstuffed furniture. The humor often poked fun at female vanity, the perceived irrationality of fashion, the expense involved, or the sheer bewilderment of men confronted by these ever-changing feminine shapes. The cartoonists must have had a dedicated bustle disaster file, ready to churn out weekly visual gags. It was a comedic goldmine, and these images, while intended to amuse, also subtly critiqued the fashion and highlighted its more absurd elements. Then there was the relatively new medium of photography. As you sat for your formal studio portrait, perhaps to commemorate a marriage, or simply to capture your likeness for posterity, your bustle would be a key feature of your carefully chosen attire. Early photography, with its long exposure times, often resulted in rather stiff, formal poses, which in a way complemented the structured, almost architectural nature of bustled gowns. The photographer's aim was to capture you at your best, your most fashionable, and the bustle was integral to that image. While candid photography was still in its infancy, later in the bustle's reign, you might occasionally glimpse more spontaneous street scenes or group photographs where the everyday reality of the bustled silhouette, in all its varied forms, was captured. The bustle also made its appearance in the literature of the era. Novelists, in their detailed descriptions of characters and settings, would often touch upon clothing as a way to establish social standing, personality, or the general atmosphere of a scene. You might find a straightforward mention of a character's fashionable turner, or perhaps a more critical author might use a character's obsession with the latest bustle style to subtly comment on vanity or superficiality. Literary critics and fashion historians often debate the extent to which descriptions of clothing in Victorian novels serve merely as realistic set dressing versus carrying deeper symbolic meanings related to character, class, or the author's social commentary. Did the heroine's choice of a modest bustle signify her virtuous practical nature, while the villainess sported the most outrageously exaggerated version? Sometimes the clues were indeed in the clothing. And of course, where there's a product, there's advertising. You'd see advertisements for the bustles themselves in newspapers and magazines, touting the latest patented designs, their lightness, their durability, their perfect shape. Some might even try to appeal to your desire for comfort, however contradictory that might seem, with names like the health bustle or the ventilated bustle, promising a less torturous experience. Dressmakers and department stores would also advertise gowns specifically designed to be worn with these essential underpinnings, showcasing how their creations achieve the height of fashion thanks to the proper foundation. You might even find the image of a fashionably bustled lady adorning rather unexpected items, perhaps a decorative biscuit tin, the colorful label of a perfume bottle, or a set of stereoscope cards offering three-dimensional views of modern life. The distinctive silhouette became an instant visual shorthand for modern womanhood of the period, or at least womanhood with an impressively engineered rear scaffolding. It's like today how a particular fashion trend can explode across social media, from high fashion runways to TikTok parodies and influencer endorsements within days. The Victorians had their own, somewhat slower, but equally potent media ecosystem that ensured the bustle was seen, discussed, and either desired or derided. If a Victorian lady were to time travel to our era and witness our endless stream of selfies and outfit of the day posts, she'd probably raise a perfectly sculpted eyebrow and remark, amateurs. We had entire magazines and legions of skilled illustrators dedicated to capturing one truly magnificent bustle. So the bustle was very much a public figure, a celebrity of the sartorial world, endlessly documented, admired, and lampooned in the popular media of its day, its image disseminated through countless illustrations and photographs. But even the most talked about star, the most ubiquitous trend, eventually fades from the limelight. What factors, then, despite its firm hold on the popular imagination and its reinforcement through various media, began to signal the end of the bustle's prominent, and often precarious, reign at the rear of fashion? The Victorian bustle, as we've seen, was a true celebrity of its time, endlessly illustrated in fashion plates, dissected by satirists, and a constant, tangible presence in your daily life as a woman of fashion. It was photographed, advertised, and discussed with fervor. But even the brightest stars in the fashion firmament must eventually dim, and the bustle, for all its prominence and structural ingenuity, was no exception. Despite its firm grip on the popular imagination and its reinforcement through every available medium, a confluence of societal shifts, evolving aesthetic tastes, and practical considerations began to signal the end of its often precarious and always pronounced reign at the rear of fashion. Like all fashion cycles, the bustle's time was inevitably finite. What once seemed the absolute pinnacle of style eventually starts to feel a little last season. By the late 1880s, after years of the rather extreme, shelf-like bustle dominating the silhouette, you would have started to notice subtle shifts. The sharp, aggressive projection began to soften. The architectural grandeur started to give way to something a little less, shall we say, cantilevered. Fashion, in its restless pursuit of novelty, was already beginning to sketch out its next chapter. A new aesthetic ideal was emerging with the approaching fin de siècle, the end of the century. The Gibson girl, as famously illustrated by Charles Dana Gibson in America, became an influential figure. She was tall, confident, and statuesque. While she still possessed an S-curve, it was achieved more through posture, that iconic forward tilt of the torso, and expert corsetry, rather than by a dramatic bustle at the back. The emphasis shifted. Skirts, while still long and full, began to achieve their shape through different means. You'd see more gored skirts, cut in panels that fitted smoothly over the hips, and then flared out dramatically towards the hem, creating a morning glory or trumpet shape. Small pads or cushions might still be worn underneath, just to give a gentle, rounded lift to the very back of the skirt and prevent it from looking entirely flat, but the prominent projecting cage was on its way out. Practical considerations, which had long been a whispered undercurrent of dissent, began to gain more traction. As you and your contemporaries found yourselves engaging more in activities outside the drawing room, the sheer impracticality of the large bustle became increasingly apparent. The rise of sports for women, like lawn tennis, croquet, and later, the cycling craze of the 1890s, demanded clothing that allowed for a far greater range of movement. You simply couldn't serve an ace or pedal a bicycle with a rigid wire cage strapped to your behind. This led to the development of specialized sporting attire, which in turn began to influence everyday fashion, subtly nudging it towards greater ease and less restriction. Simultaneously, more women were entering the workforce in various capacities, as teachers, typists, shop assistants. For these women, cumbersome, restrictive clothing was not just an inconvenience, but a genuine hindrance to their daily tasks. The arguments of the dress reform movement, which had been advocating for healthier, more rational clothing for decades, perhaps started to resonate more broadly, or at least the general consciousness about the relationship between clothing, health, and practicality, was slowly being raised. Technological innovations in dressmaking and new design approaches also played their part. Clever cutting techniques, like the aforementioned gored panels, allowed skilled dressmakers to create shape and fullness in skirts without relying so heavily on internal scaffolding. The flowing, organic lines of the Art Nouveau style, which became influential in decorative arts and design towards the end of the century, also favored a more sinuous, less rigidly structured silhouette. It's a mainstream historical fact that the fashion silhouette of the 1890s saw the bustle shrink dramatically, often to a mere pad, or disappear entirely. The focus shifted to other areas of exaggeration, such as enormous leg of mutton sleeves, which balanced the flared skirts and the still tightly corseted waist, creating a new version of the hourglass figure. The decline of the bustle wasn't a sudden, dramatic event, like a theater curtain falling abruptly. It was a more gradual fade. For a while, during the early 1890s, you might still see smaller, softer bustles or bustle pads being worn to give a slight lift and fashionable roundness to the back of the skirt. Some older or more conservative women, accustomed to the silhouette, might have clung to their bustles for a little longer, perhaps viewing the newer, less structured styles with a degree of suspicion. But by the early years of the 20th century, as the Edwardian era dawned, the prominent bustle was decidedly a thing of the past in high fashion. The new ideal was a long, lean, S-shaped figure, achieved with a very specific style of corset, but without that distinct posterior projection that had defined previous decades. The steel and whalebone merchants, who had profited so handsomely during the bustle's heyday, probably noticed a distinct downturn in orders for their particular wares. "What do you mean, madam?" You can almost hear them lamenting. "You no longer require a small personal suspension bridge for your derriere." Fashion historians continue to analyze the complex interplay of factors that led to the bustle's demise. Was it primarily changing aesthetic tastes, a collective tiring of one particular extreme? Was it the practical needs of increasingly active and publicly visible women asserting themselves? Or was it part of broader socio-cultural shifts occurring at the fin de siècle as ideas about women's roles and capabilities began, ever so slowly, to evolve? The answer, most likely, is a combination of all these elements. And what became of all those elaborate wire cages and horsehair pads once they were no longer de rigueur? One likes to imagine old wire bustles being ingeniously repurposed in gardens as surprisingly elegant, if slightly menacing cloches for protecting delicate spring seedlings from late frosts, or perhaps even finding a second, rather avant-garde life as lampshades in particularly bohemian households. More likely, many were simply stored away in attics, eventually discarded, their moment of glory over. The chairs of the 1890s and early 1900s probably breathed a collective sigh of relief too, no longer under threat from aggressively projecting, shelf-like appendages. And so, the once mighty bustle, the undisputed queen of posterior fashion for a significant slice of the Victorian era, gradually receded from the stage, making way for new silhouettes, new ideals, and new sartorial challenges. But, like any significant cultural artifact, especially one that so dramatically reshaped the human form, it didn't just vanish without a trace. What legacy did it leave behind, and how do we, looking back from our modern vantage point, remember this most peculiar and particular garment? And so the once mighty bustle, that remarkable feat of Victorian engineering and unquestioned empress of posterior fashion, gradually yielded its prominent place on the sartorial stage. It receded like a tide, leaving behind faint impressions on the sands of style, eventually becoming a fascinating relic of a bygone era. But, like any truly significant cultural artifact, especially one that so dramatically and visibly reshaped the human form, the bustle didn't just vanish without a trace. Its legacy, however peculiar, endures, and the way we remember this most particular garment offers a curious reflection on fashion, society, and ourselves. Today, when you see a bustle, perhaps in a period drama, meticulously recreating the 1870s or 80s, or as a carefully preserved specimen in a museum exhibit, it acts as an instant historical marker. It transports you, visually at least, to the world of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages, of strict social codes and elaborate etiquette. It's a powerful visual shorthand for the Victorian era, its very extravagance and artificiality speaking volumes about the time. While the extreme cage bustle hasn't made a significant mainstream comeback, and your lower back is probably breathing a sigh of relief at that thought, its influence, or at least the principle of accentuating the posterior, has subtly echoed through fashion history. You might see hints of it in the structured peplums of a tailored jacket, designed to give a little kick and curve just above the hips, or in the dramatic drapery and trains of certain avant-garde evening gowns. Fashion, after all, has a long memory and a penchant for cannibalizing its own past, reinterpreting historical forms for a new age. It's a mainstream historical fact that while not direct revivals, elements of back fullness or exaggerated hip shapes have appeared in 20th and 21st century designs. Think of Christian Dior's new look in 1947, which, while primarily focused on a nipped waist and full skirt, certainly created a very feminine, shapely lower torso that owed something to historical ideals of an hourglass figure. The bustle, then, takes its place in that long, curious lineage of underpinnings, from farthingales to panniers to crinolines, all dedicated to the art of sculpting the female form into whatever shape the era deemed most desirable. How you, from your modern vantage point, view the bustle likely depends on your perspective. Is it primarily a symbol of female oppression, a physical manifestation of restrictive social norms and unhealthy beauty standards? There's certainly a strong case for that, given the discomfort, the health concerns, and the sheer impracticality we've discussed. Or do you also see in it a strange kind of artistry, a testament to incredible craftsmanship, a bold and unapologetic embrace of artifice in the pursuit of a distinct aesthetic vision? Perhaps the truth, as it so often does, lies somewhere in the balance of these views. It was, undeniably, a garment that both constrained and, in its own way, empowered through the currency of fashion and status. Curators and fashion historians continue to debate the best ways to interpret and display historical garments like the bustle in museum settings. Should the focus be on their aesthetic beauty as objects, their intricate construction, or should equal, if not greater, emphasis be placed on the social implications, the lived experience of wearing them, the discomfort they often caused? Finding a balance that provides a nuanced understanding for contemporary audiences, allowing us to appreciate the object while also critically engaging with its context, remains an ongoing conversation in the world of material culture. And what of our modern sensibilities? We live in an age that, at least in many circles, purports to value comfort, practicality, and a more natural look in clothing. The idea of strapping on a wire cage and multiple layers of petticoats just to achieve a fashionable backside might seem utterly bizarre, almost comically alien. And yet, before you get too comfortable on your pedestal of sensible modern dress, take a moment to consider Do we not have our own contemporary versions of the bustle, perhaps not in steel and whalebone, but in other forms? That pair of stunning shoes that makes you want to weep after an hour, the jeans so tight they feel like a second skin or a tourniquet, the shapewear that promises a magically smooth silhouette, but leaves you longing to simply breathe freely. We all, it seems, make our own sacrifices at the altar of fashion, enduring varying degrees of discomfort or restriction to feel attractive, confident, or simply on trend. Our methods may be different, the materials less overtly industrial, but the human impulse to shape, adorn, and sometimes suffer for our appearance endures. One quirky and rather delightful legacy of the bustle can be seen in modern steampunk fashion. This subgenre, with its imaginative fusion of Victorian aesthetics and retro-futuristic technology, often joyfully incorporates bustles, corsets, and other historical elements, reinterpreting them in playful, creative, and often much more comfortable ways. It's a nod to the past, but with a knowing wink and a spirit of fun. You might also see echoes of the bustle's grandeur in the elaborate trains and structured skirts of some high-fashion bridal wear, where the desire for a dramatic, once-in-a-lifetime silhouette allows for a touch of historical extravagance. And so, our journey through the world of the Victorian bustle, with all its curious contraptions, its social signals, and its surprising endurance, now draws to a gentle, sleepy close. The rustle of silk, the faint creak of whalebone, the metallic whisper of spring steel, these sounds begin to fade, merging into the quiet hum of the past. Imagine those elaborate structures, those cages and cushions, now resting silently in museum archives, their once vibrant role in daily life reduced to that of historical artifacts. Or perhaps you see them as faint, ghostly images in old, sepia-toned photographs and carefully preserved fashion plates, the women who wore them gazing out at us from across the decades, their expressions serene, their postures perfect, their secrets held fast. The lives they lived, with all their unique daily struggles and small triumphs, their hushed conversations in drawing rooms, their laughter at croquet parties, their endurance of fashions that both defined and confined them, are now woven into the rich tapestry of history's long dream. Let the echoes of their world, the sheer, almost unimaginable dedication to such a peculiar form of beauty, become a soft, distant curiosity as you prepare for your own rest. Let the thought of their structured world gently remind you of the simple, unadorned comfort that now surrounds you. As you drift further and further into your own peaceful slumber, perhaps you can appreciate anew the uncomplicated ease of your own bed, the unencumbered freedom of your limbs beneath soft covers. There are no corsets here to restrict your breath, no wire cages to navigate in the dim light, no societal expectations pressing upon your form. There is only the gentle, yielding embrace of sleep, the quiet stillness of the night, and the promise of rest. Allow yourself to sink into that profound comfort, feeling any lingering thoughts about Victorian underpinnings simply dissolve, like sugar in warm tea, leaving only a sense of calm and impending peace. Sweet dreams.